Hello, and welcome to A Dash of Salt with AJ. I'm your host, Ahsoka Jackson. This isn't one of those channels focused on news and updates, but I do have a couple of quick notes here that I figure fans will appreciate hearing if they haven't already. First of all, we now have an end date and end chapter number for the Attack on Titan manga, which makes me sad even thinking about, but here's to hoping this incredible journey comes to a fitting end. Chapter 139 will be the last chapter, and as you know, 13 and 9 are both significant numbers in Attack on Titan. 9 for the 9 original Titan shifters after Ymir, and a time limit of 13 years under the curse of Ymir. The release date for the chapter itself will be April 9th, and then June 9th will be the release date for the final volume. Also, April is the 4th month of the year, so 4 plus 9 gets us back to 13 again. And the final volume will be volume 34. April 9th, 2021 would be written numerically as 4-9-21. And 4 plus 9 plus 21 equals 34. What's more, as fans have pointed out, Hajime Isayama himself is 34 years old now, and will be until after the end of the manga. So the numbers are just lining up perfectly for the finale. Always gotta put in those extra details, up to the very end. Although it's still really sad to think of its ending at all. And in more cheerful news, they've begun airing the English dub now. They have the first episode of it out currently. And having watched it, I really like Gabby's voice. I think it really suits her brash, cocky, and a bit bratty character very, very well. She's also great at carrying that energy of determination and fieriness, where she's a lot like young Eren. And I felt like I connected to her well emotionally, and felt not just the confidence, but also how important the cause is to her, because she believes what Marley's been telling them, and she genuinely believes that the folks on Paradise are evil, and that taking them out is the path to freedom for the rest of the Eldians. The voices for Udo, Magath, and Zofia I also quite like. Reiner and Falco, I'm more iffy on. Falco sounds maybe a bit older than he should, and with Reiner, I really enjoy the voice itself, but I don't know how well it suits Reiner for me. I mean, yes, Reiner is actually only about 21, but for me the Japanese voice, which sounds so heavy and weathered, actually fits the character much better. He looks older and comes off older than he chronologically is, and the voice really suits that. And even though it's a deep voice, it actually feels very vulnerable and fragile, which really is Reiner at this point. He's this big guy who looks really tough and intimidating, but he's very broken now as a person due to all the trauma and the guilt and regret. So I really like Reiner's English voice in isolation. It's very pleasant to listen to, and I'll still enjoy getting to hear it and the very different feel it'll bring, but I feel like the Japanese voice suits the character far better. Zeke is kind of in between for me. I currently feel like the Japanese voice feels more imposing and authoritative, and suits Zeke's position and his firmness or stubbornness of conviction, but I feel better about it than Falco's and Reiner's voices at the moment. I tell you what though, I cannot wait to hear what Eren is going to sound like now. Bryce, please do not let us down, man. There are going to be so many epic scenes this season, and so much emotional weight and intensity, and with all the complex stuff going on with Eren this time around. I know, no pressure, right? But for real, if this works out well in the dub, then I'm nothing but thrilled at the idea of having multiple versions to enjoy. I'm one of those folks who will actually listen to something in multiple different languages if I enjoy the voice acting or the characters themselves a lot. Plus, it can sometimes be a way of getting additional clarity or dimension to the storyline via dialogue. And as long as I still have the English subtitles for translation, it's fine. Like, I have the Star Wars The Clone Wars movie on DVD, and I've watched it in English, French, and Spanish. Tano's Spanish voice is actually my favorite of the 3 versions. So, having discussed the whole topic of the revised history and Marley's idiotic and obscene current plans, courtesy of Willie, I guess it would be a good point to bring up other aspects of the episode. That sequence where Peak and Galliard were being led away, I sort of suspect that Peak was up to something there. She already seemed kind of suspicious of the soldier that lured them, and I feel like she was doing something deliberate when she went to go greet her team from the Panzer unit. I mean, it looks like a really sweet moment at face value. Like, it's really neat to see how much she cares about her unit, and I do believe that part of it is genuine, or, was a genuine gesture. But it just felt very out of place. It was so boisterous of her, and from what we've seen of Peak, she has a very languid manner to her, and she likes to quietly comment and observe. She has a bit of a feline, Cheshire cat aspect to her. We haven't spent a ton of time with her thus far, but based on what we have seen, pouncing on the guys like an overjoyed golden retriever seems a little out of character, no? I really feel like she either passed something to the guy, took something from him, or is just trying to make sure that the team took notice of the moment and remembered where she and Galliard were last seen. Maybe some combo of those things. The vibe of that little moment just felt off to me. And speaking of little moments, did you notice how Lady Kiyomi, the dignitary from Hizuru, left right before the big speech? Everybody else was gathering or already waiting, but she was getting out of Dodge. I didn't really even take notice of that until my second viewing, actually. I'd been more focused on her compliments to Willie and comments about his bravery and all. Let's see, what else? Okay, I'm curious where they're taking Zeke off to, because they split him up from the rest of the team. He is the main strategist for the warrior unit, from what I understand, and is known as the war chief. So, could it be that they felt leading all three of them into a trap together would be too difficult? In any case, the whole trap thing, it was good to have that reminder that despite the massive power and ability that they have, Titans and Titan shifters do have their various limitations and vulnerabilities. And that's besides just stuff like getting cut out of the nape and all. This has come up before in the series, but it was good to revisit that whole issue. That Titans can't shift when they're trapped underground like that. Apparently the strength of their physical form is not enough to overcome their level of resistance, and they wouldn't be able to form properly. Actually, wait a minute. How the fudge was Eren able to shift then? Okay, maybe that depends on how far underground they are and what level of resistance they'd actually get from the surroundings. Like with Galliard and Peak, the trap was almost like an old well, and it was dug pretty deeply into the earth. Maybe the thick expanse of like rock and dirt surrounding the place was substantial enough that they wouldn't have been able to break through. And I assume the same thing applied to the jail cells that Eren has been kept in before. Maybe they've been deep enough down that he wouldn't have been able to break through. Meanwhile, the place he and Reiner were in, they were just below street level, and Eren said that housing development was directly above them. So I guess the ceiling of that basement, and then the regular other floors, walls, and ceilings of the building weren't enough to prevent a transformation. But maybe if they had been deeper underground and he was dealing with a large amount of solid dirt or bedrock, then he would have been trapped. That's really the only explanation I can come up with for that the horizontal and vertical barriers surrounding Eren in that space were weak enough that his transformation would overcome them rather than being compressed or blocked by them. I think I'm going to take a look at what other fans have to say here, see if they pretty much have the same explanation for it or not. And I'm sure some of them can cite the relevant information we've gotten about that in the past seasons. In any case, I'm not going to worry about doing this in chronological order, especially since I really want to save Reiner and Eren's exchange as the main thing. So since I was already talking about the transformation moment, I'd like to highlight a few things I noticed from the very end of the episode plus the preview. Oh, there's one quick thing I noticed towards the end, but a little bit before it. When Willie got to the point in his speech where he started talking about Eren and how he now had possession of the Titan powers, there's that puppet they used to represent Eren's Titan form. That's what I want to start off with next episode, since we're close to the end of this one. Thanks for listening to today, and I hope you enjoyed the episode. Next time, I'll be explaining what I observed about the puppet and the questions that's now raising for me. I'll also share my thoughts about the new glimpses we now have of Mappa's rendition of the Attack Titan. In the meantime, if you're enjoying the podcast, please don't forget to subscribe and turn your notifications on so you can get updates. You can also help make the show visible for new viewers by leaving a like, share, comment, or review on whichever platform you use to listen. YouTube, Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Radio Public, Spotify, etc. Until next episode, be blessed and stay salty. Hello, listeners, and welcome to A Dash of Salt with AJ. I'm your host, Ahsoka Jackson, blogger, podcaster, poet, and freelance proofreader. Last time we left off, I was about to draw attention to something I had noticed about the puppet that Willie Tiber used to represent Aaron, and the questions this has sparked for me. So that's where we'll start off today. Let's begin. What I realized is that the puppet looks an awful lot like that pretty menacing version of the attack titan that they use in the opening sequence for the show now. I still think it's probably meant to be like a hardened version, but the one that they show either leading or being pursued by the other titans in the last few seconds of the opening theme and sequence. You could simply say that maybe it just represents Aaron's form of the attack titan, or even sort of a standardized, basic version of what the attack titan looks like. Although actually, one thing I just thought about is that the way a titan looks can vary quite a bit between shifters. Galliard and Cadet Ymir's jaw titan forms look vastly different from each other. And then the attack titan forms for Aaron Yeager, Grisha Yeager, and Aaron Kruger, the original Aaron Kruger, aka the Owl. Those three versions of the attack titan all look pretty different from each other. And Aaron is currently holding both the attack titan and the coordinate or founding titan, though it seems like the attack titan is still the main thing we see coming through. And maybe I'm reading too much into this, but could it be that this version of the attack titan that we see in the opening and with the puppet is roughly how the very first attack titan looked? Maybe the puppet is based on that, and maybe it just so happens that our boy Aaron happens to bear a special resemblance to our original attack titan. Man, this could have all kinds of meaning. That's the big thing I'm really wondering about right now. In any case, that actually brings me pretty nicely to this new look we finally got at how Aaron's attack titan now appears in Mappa's style. It looks like it's staying fairly close to what we saw in the pre-animated trailer. The preview showed its version of that same shot where Aaron is sort of crouching as he watches the Warhammer titan form. But yeah, it's looking pretty darn sick. I'm excited. I mean, this thing is looking creepy and sinister as heck. I loved that one close-up shot of the face. And that's absolutely magnificent. This thing should look terrifying. And don't get me wrong, Aaron's 40-foot MMA fighter of a titan already looks plenty scary in the first 3 seasons. Scary and absolutely kick butt, okay? It just looks even more terrifying nowadays. Like the way the face and teeth look, and it has these sharper angles to it. And it probably does look even more like what we see in the opening sequence than the previous versions of Aaron's titan have. But either way, I really like what Mappa's doing here. And now that we're getting a better look at it, it definitely does seem to confirm what I was saying before about how the attack titan and Aaron are each resembling each other more over time. It seems like it may be taller now. That's sort of hard to say, but it's definitely bulked up and gotten this heavier build to it. That brings me to another detail I spotted here. I realized that at one point we only see one of its eyes glowing, the right eye. The left eye of the titan, which is the same eye Aaron is missing right now, it's actually sort of white or grayed out when we get a close-up of the attack titan's face in the episode 6 preview. That's really interesting in 2 senses for me. For one thing, it suggests that he still hasn't fully healed his real eye at this point, even though we saw him healing his leg. And more importantly, it demonstrates that there's a stronger and more direct link than I realized between the condition of a shifter's real human body and their titan form. Apparently, the missing eye significantly affects the formation of the titan itself. I will say as a quick caveat here that I'm uncertain about the exact timing, because at the end of episode 5 itself, it looks like both eyes are glowing just fine. So it could be that there's some other injury that occurs later that's actually what causes the eye damage. But right now I'm working from the theory that it actually is directly related to the fact that his left eye in human form was gouged out. Now, I've mentioned my observations before about how Aaron's human and titan forms seem to be merging in a sense, with each resembling the other more closely over time, but I hadn't realized how direct and literal it could be. And some fans have taken it even further, theorizing that the way a titan appears may also be influenced by the current mental/emotional state of its shifter. You remember what I said earlier about how this current version of the attack titan looks more sinister and creepy than before? Well, some fans feel that there are subtle shifts we see in the art style that show both Reiner gaining his humanity as the season progresses, while Aaron goes the opposite direction. And in this episode, plus the preview for episode 6, the Warhammer Titan, we see the beginning of a darker version of Aaron now. We've had incidents before, like the battle against Annie and Stoas, where there was accidental collateral damage, but in this episode, it gets really different. Eren knowingly transforms and tears apart a building full of civilians. Heck, he used that as a threat to keep Reiner in check, and then he did it anyways, so it's not like he isn't cognizant of what his actions will result in here. And the preview indicates that the carnage involving civilians just continues from there. I don't think those civilians were particularly his targets, but he's willing to slaughter them to achieve his goals and reach his actual targets. That's something we're going to have to address, though I'm holding off until we get more into the combo between Eren and Reiner. And the preview? It's interesting to see how different versions of the translation for the narration there describe Eren's actions, but you get the feeling that they're not pulling punches here. I think one version used the term atrocity and talked about Eren's facing judgment for his actions in the form of the Warhammer Titan. I definitely wish I knew what an exact translation would be here, because you definitely see different sources maybe putting their own spin on it. What the one from Hulu says is, "The attack titan suddenly appears. Amid its roars, the crowd is slaughtered mercilessly. To stop Eren's rampage, the Warhammer swings." And the visual part of the preview, and heck, what we see with the housing complex, definitely shows us that innocent civilians, children, they're very much getting caught up in this. Like I said, we'll get into that more later, but this does mark a turning point for us in the story, and with regards to Eren's character. We're starting to see a different sort of ruthlessness from this formerly bright-eyed kid who now has this very different aura to himself. Speaking of which, I just realized, looking at the art again, that Eren's current Attack Titan form also just looks more like an adult now. Whereas its previous form looked more youthful and more teenager-like, this one has not only a more adult frame, but also a more weathered and adult-like face as well. But anyways, I'm bringing this up in connection to what folks were suggesting about the Attack Titan and its physical appearance now, and that's definitely an interesting question to consider and watch for. And since I'm reading the manga alongside the anime episodes, it'll be interesting to look at both Reiner's and Eren's Titan forms as the season progresses, and see if I notice those changes that other folks are seeing. But yeah, those are my thoughts on the Attack Titan's appearance, which is different now not only due to the change in the studios, but also because the manga itself does change things as we go into Season 4. I've said this before, but it's worth repeating. It's not just about the studio shift. Our characters also look different because time has passed, and they haven't stayed identical to their previous versions. Anyways, the other little details I wanted to note were really minor, and I don't think they're of special importance narratively, but if you know Attack on Titan, you know how much care is taken when it comes to details, right? And I think these are just really nice little touches. Number 1, when they go into slow motion and show the crowd staring up at Eren in horror and shock, it's a largely still shot where everyone is frozen in terror, but you actually see casualties already beginning to happen in the crowd of VIPs as a result of the debris that's gone flying. That's something I caught on rewatch of the episode. You actually see at least one guy's head getting crushed in the background during that slow motion shot. Number 2, this is just the music for the preview, and they're probably going to use a different track in the episode itself, but they show someone being sort of run into and run over by the crowd, and if you listen to the music, you hear a percussive beat right as the guy is hit. I definitely don't think that's a coincidence. It kind of reminds me of how in John Wick, they'll actively have the timing of the gunshots synced and choreographed to the background music that's playing. I've already compared the two series before, because although they're very different, they both do share themes of revenge, of tragic figures, self-destruction, and a struggle for freedom. They also share this whole element of having this crazy, incredible attention to detail, and it's shown for both things that have storytelling benefit and things that simply provide more aesthetic and artistic benefit. And come to think of it, both series also like to reference and incorporate mythological and symbolic aspects a lot. Anyways, I love the fact that even a super quick episode preview has that amount of care put into making it as perfect as possible. You've got to give them credit for that. Thanks for listening today, and I hope you had a great time. If you're enjoying the podcast, please don't forget to subscribe and turn your notifications on so you can get updates. You can also help make the show visible for new viewers by leaving a like, share, comment, or review on whichever platform you use to listen. Until next episode, be blessed and stay salty. Hello, listeners, and welcome to A Dash of Salt with AJ. I'm your host, Ahsoka Jackson, author, blogger, poet, and freelance proofreader. So, I've covered the stuff with Gaudiard, the Peak, and the rest, plus some miscellaneous details. So I think that finally gets most of it out of the way so we can proceed to the core of the episode, with the conversation between Reiner, Aaron, and Falco. There is still the soundtrack though, so I gotta remember to mention that later. Actually, you know what? I'll do this now. The soundtrack for this episode was darned good. My favorite part would definitely have to be the music that kicks in towards the end, when Reiner says that Carla's death was his fault, and then it cuts to Willie saying, "I cursed the blood I was born with. More than anyone, I wished the Eldians were wiped out." All throughout the episode, the music really contributed to the mood, and the way that it helped escalate the already super high levels of drama and tension and intensity. Whew. This episode was relentlessly tense and anxiety-inducing, and the music just kept that going. And my best friend is a ballet dancer, and she definitely had a particular appreciation for the way the soundtrack was employed as well. I figured it was right up her alley with the whole theater side of her work and the way music is used there. Now, I have to address something here. I've heard that one of the key staff members for this season, I think the series director, ended up having to lock his Twitter account to private because he was being harassed and threatened so much. Why? Because he didn't use the particular track folks were hoping for, "You See Big Girl," during Aaron's transformation moment in episode 5. If this is true, then it's freaking shameful. First of all, that kind of behavior is unacceptable and completely out of line. It's completely disproportionate to the situation. If you haven't figured it out 30 podcast episodes in, I'm very passionate about Attack on Titan. But harassing and threatening someone because they didn't use the musical track you were hoping for? It's funny, the track's name is "You See Big Girl," and folks are acting like really big spoiled children over it, apparently. I agree with what another content creator said. If you're that bent out of shape over this, then you've probably given anime a disproportionate level of priority in your life, to where you actually think that a situation like this warrants such an extreme reaction. Second of all, it's already screwed up how much of a hard time Mappa has been getting this season, and now folks are allegedly exacerbating that with verbal abuse of the staff, the same staff that's clearly been working its behind off on this project. I really hope these folks get the credit they deserve eventually, instead of this absolute bull to deal with. Third of all, we actually did get a little that track playing at the very end of episode 4 when Reiner and Aaron finally reunite. So we actually did get a great little nod there to that music and to that whole revelation scene from the previous seasons. I made sure to highlight that in my reaction to episode 4. And the fourth thing is that I feel that this was a no-win situation. That track seems to be the most popular selection for fan eds and animations of that scene already. And I've seen some awesome fan versions, by the way. I'm not throwing shade at them at all. But I suspect the very fact that it was a popular choice for fan content may have made it all the less likely to be selected in the official production. They probably would have felt that it was too predictable, plus they likely would have risked having folks complain about a lack of creativity, and probably even accuse them of just stealing from or imitating fan content. So the fact that they chose to use new and different music, the fact that they had the nerve to do something original versus leaning on the one track a lot of people were semi-expecting, I applaud them for that, and I believe it was the wisest choice. And I feel that the music they did use definitely suited the scene and the tone for both the moment itself and what's about to follow. By the way, there are also fan edits already where people have taken the anime scene and set it to the older track, so if that's something you really wanted to see, you still can actually. And look guys, let's try to be sane here. I really love the 5th opening song for the series, and I hope they bring it back at some point. It's such a moving and powerful piece, and it's extremely relevant to the events of Season 4. But I have no intentions of losing my marbles and being vile to the staff if they don't freaking use it. There's some really lovely aspects of the Attack on Titan community, but this sort of thing is the stuff that gives anime fandoms and other fandoms a bad reputation and makes people want to steer clear. Heck, imagine being a staff member and knowing that your reward for putting in painstaking work for this amazing series would be to have its fans threatening your life or calling you every name under the sun for not catering to their personal whims. I'm not saying that you're not allowed to criticize aspects of the work or to express your displeasure over different things. But if what I'm hearing about is the situation is true, people have really crossed some major lines there, and the way they're behaving is uncalled for. And it may also backfire on them in multiple ways as well. Okay, scolding over, this just made me think of a movie quote I saw recently that I referenced for Attack on Titan when I was talking to my friend about the characters and the psychological issues the characters have. Sell crazy someplace else. We're all stocked up here. There's enough madness within the story world and characters of Attack on Titan. We don't really need to add our extra layer of craziness to it like that, okay? Wanted to end with a little levity there. But now we can finally start talking about how the basement scene itself played out. I was concerned that pacing would be an issue in this episode, because obviously what we all really want to get to is the confrontation between Reiner and his best buddy, right? And I was really concerned that I'd end up feeling impatient waiting for those parts and trying to get through the segments with Willie. But they did such a good job with it, actually. The way they alternated back and forth between the stage production, the situation with the warrior unit, and the confrontation between our boys. It kept the tension up the whole darn time, and I just had this anxiety throughout as I was waiting for the other shoe to drop. And the alternations were also frequent enough that I was able to be genuinely interested in Tiber's speech and appreciate it. Far from being impatient and just waiting for sequences to end, I was instead really having to stay focused to keep up with everything happening across the three main scenes. That's another way I got that John Wick 3 feeling. I had that experience of being overwhelmed by everything that was going on, and even the quiet moments were so intense that they had your heart beating almost as much as it would have during an action sequence, if not the same. And technically, this was almost all drama and quiet scenes versus action, yet it was absolutely thrilling and had me freaking out throughout. Of course, that finally brings us to the highlight of this episode, the basement scene. This, I might actually go through more chronologically to make sure I don't miss anything I want to note. Oh, I remember someone saying the animation for this episode was pretty meh to them, but as folks noted, this was a largely drama-centered and conversation-centered episode with naturally a lot more stillness to the shots. And the action animation is really going to come in the next several episodes, where we're finally seeing Eren in combat for our first time this season. And B, what are you even talking about, really? Because for me, stuff like the body language and facial expressions and everything were just so well done. And I was just drinking it all in and trying to get a handle on what was going on inside all these different characters' heads. Peak, Tiber, the crowd as it was being led through this narrative and emotional journey by Tiber. And of course, our central trio of Reiner Braun, Falco Grice, and Eren Yeager. Like I said, this episode was handled so well that I actually cared about and really was paying attention to the other characters and not just our most important ones. Of course, one advantage I had is that I already understood that this was going to be a pretty crucial scene. Because it's this sequence we have with Willie and the war declaration that gives us insight into what actually pulled the trigger and what finally cleared the way for Eren to attack. So it's super important for me to see what Willie himself actually said and how the crowd reacted to it, and how Eren was reacting as he multitasked and listened to the whole thing while carrying on his conversation with Reiner. And it's not just about the actions that take place there either. It's also about his emotional reactions and the little expressions and shifts you see there from him. In particular, there was a precise moment someone mentioned a while back that I really want to see in full context, and now I finally have. I'm going to get to that in a bit. But right now, it's time to sign off. Next episode, we'll pick back up and start going through this whole scene in detail. And I do mean detail. So I really hope you'll enjoy this whole section of the reaction. It's going to take several installments of the podcast to cover, for sure. Thanks for listening today, and I hope you had a great time. If you're enjoying the podcast, please don't forget to subscribe and turn your notifications on so you can get updates. You can also help make the show visible for new viewers by leaving a like, share, comment, or review on whichever platform you use to listen. Until next episode, be blessed and stay salty. Hello listeners, and welcome to A Dash of Salt with AJ. I'm your host, Ahsoka Jackson, author, blogger, poet, and freelance proofreader. We're finally beginning our deep dive into this amazing exchange between Reiner and Eren, so I'm excited as heck, and I hope you are too. Let's get into this. First of all, I mentioned before how tense and terrifying the situation instantly was for Reiner, with the post-credits scene in episode 4, where the two finally meet for a second, and Eren gives him that greeting that contains the callback to prior seasons, and it's explicitly confirmed for the audience that this is Eren. It's like, welcome to the House of Death and Destruction. What would you like for us to dish out today? How about a nice big platter of karma that's been carefully chilled and aged for the past 4 years? That strike your fancy? But if you thought that moment was scary, it immediately got amped the heck up in this episode. Because, holy cow, I was right in saying that calm Eren may actually be the most freaking terrifying version we've had of this kid. We've seen him go berserk in both Titan form and human form. We've seen him promise to annihilate his enemies and exact revenge and make folks suffer. But the calm Eren, who's just patiently walking you down memory lane and to your execution grounds? God dang. It makes me think of that whole sequence when he was 9 years old and rescued Mikasa from the sex traffickers. It was the calm moments, like when he stabs the guy while talking to him, and then later when he disappeared into that one room so he could ambush someone else. Those little moments with him had some of the most eerie and menacing vibes from Eren. Even more than when he was being more wildly violent and aggressive. And his expressions in that scene really sealed it. And now we kind of have that back. I'd probably have been way less scared if he'd actually been yelling at Reiner or if he'd punched him out already. Instead, he just sits there and calmly invites Reiner to take a seat. This is the perfect place to have a nice little chat and also listen to that wonderful speech that's about to declare war on my nation after Marley has already been very actively screwing us over for nearly a decade and somewhat more passively screwing us over for decades before that. It's all about efficiency, you know? That's one thing he's learned in the military, I'm sure. But from the moment this conversation begins, Eren's the one holding the cards here. And he doesn't hesitate in the least to make that clear. He freaking spells it out for Reiner. He already has the advantage via the element of shock and surprise here, and then he promptly presses the advantage by outlining for Reiner what's at stake and what's going to happen if he doesn't cooperate. Eren's got his finger on the trigger, and he's holding a whole freaking building complex hostage. I mean, I'm sure pretty much anywhere in Liberia would be a serious problem for Eren to transform in. But here, not only is he near the stage, but we also have this whole building full of civilians overhead. Directly overhead, as he so patiently and helpfully points out to Reiner. And speaking of finger on the trigger, Eren has already sliced his palm open at this point. He's not even going to have the slight delay of needing to bite into his hand or arm here, or slice his finger like Annie does with the silver ring. That's already covered. So he's saying to Reiner that if he blinks wrong, Eren can transform then and there and instantly obliterate the apartments above them. There is no stopping him. There's only listening and hoping that you can negotiate. Like, about the only way I see that they maybe could have stopped him is by sniping him through that little barred vent or window they had at street level. If they shot him in the head at that point, that should have killed him before he could do anything to prevent it. But otherwise, he chose a place that only had one entrance and exit, and it basically formed a nice bottleneck as well. Of course, Eren wasn't concerned about using firearms or anything there, so he didn't need to establish a kill box or corridor like that. But I think it's safe to say that he was set up very well in that whole scene, so that there was a minimal level of vulnerability, and he would be able to take action if anyone from the outside did interfere, or if Reiner got any brilliant ideas. Because this does just seem to be the day for those, right? Brilliant ideas. Oh, this also demonstrates again on a smaller scale what we've already seen with Eren's left eye and left leg. I think this is the second time he's lost that leg, by the way. And what we also saw with Reiner's arm injury and Annie's healing while in Titan form. Shifters can actually control their healing in both human and Titan form, and they can choose to either suppress it or to focus the healing energy on a specific area so that it heals faster while the other areas are delayed. And come to think of it, that's further multitasking we have happening in the scene. I don't know if healing suppression is an active or passive thing. That is, I'm not sure if you have to continually make the decision to stop the healing, or just make the decision once, or whatever else. But in this scene, Eren is regrowing his missing left leg, while having the wound on his right palm stay open. His eye, I'm unsure about. And if you don't recall what I was talking about with Annie, that was back in the forest of giant trees, where after Squad Levi attacked her, and thought they had a handle on how long her regenerative abilities took, She ambushed them by channeling the healing to one of her eyes so that she regained use of it sooner and could see well enough to fight them again before the normal recovery time had elapsed. And as we saw, Annie absolutely excelled at using her Titan form. Meanwhile, I'm pretty sure this is the first time we've seen Eren using that level of fine-tuned control, so it gives us a little hint of how much his skill and mastery levels have increased in the 3 years since we've last seen him. And we didn't see him shift at all in the last episode of Season 3, so while it's been 3 years since we've seen him in general, I think it's been 4 years since we actually saw him use his Titan form. That was the battle where he and Armin finally took down Bertolt, and Eren used the hardening abilities to seal the breach and reclaim Shiganshina. Oh, that's right. Eren has hardening abilities now, and he used them really darn well in that scene, so that's another thing he has in his toolkit currently, and which he should be even more advanced in the use of by now. And if I'm remembering correctly, he got a hold of a serum that enabled the hardening ability as a direct result of the attempt to kidnap himself in Historia, right? Now that was part of the internal battle in Paradise rather than the one against Marley, but it's another example of how things have backfired and how attempts to attack our characters have resulted in their gaining knowledge and abilities. Marley's attack led to Paradise's discovery of the truth, and Rod Reese's pursuit of Eren and Historia led to Rod's death and Eren's acquisition of a high-level hardening ability after his previous attempts at it had been unfruitful. Thanks for that, Rod. Probably the one good thing you inadvertently managed to do in your darned life. Well, that and being Historia's biological father. At least you weren't completely freaking useless, you cowardly, decrepit son of a gun. But back to that scene. We have an Eren with absolute ice water in his veins, casually threatening to slaughter the people in the housing complex. And of course the irony is that the son of a gun does it anyways, even though Reiner does cooperate in the scene. And I figured the brat was always going to do that if Marley went through the war declaration, so it was really sort of a bluff of sorts. But rather than being the empty threat type of bluff, it was one where the positive outcome he was offering was the actual bluff, because he was going to kill those civilians whether or not Reiner cooperated. You know, what I said before about how another commentator made a really good observation and singled out the fact that Reiner has a certain manipulative streak to him? Well, we've been seeing certain parallels between Reiner and Eren, and it's being increasingly highlighted as Season 4 progresses. Eren is now the undercover infiltrator about to launch a surprise attack, causing massive chaos and destruction. Arguably more than the attack on Shiganshina did, because as I understand it, that was largely a pretty ordinary, neutral, civilian location, aside from being one of the lower areas that was meant to concentrate Titan attacks for more efficient perimeter defense. But the place and time Eren's about to strike is absolutely chock full of high-value targets from not only Marley, but also other nations. This is going to have a massive impact, and it carries enormous implications for Paradise. We'll talk about that more later, but before I digress too much, in this scene and prior to it, the solar parallel we see is that Eren also has this manipulative streak as well. I don't think we really saw this with the younger Eren. He was very blunt and straightforward and largely just said what he thought. And when he influenced folks, it was somewhat by chance, and it surprised even himself. Like when his comrades started joining the scout regiment after his words to them, he was actually really shocked by that, and I'm not saying that it would have been a manipulative thing if he had hoped for it. I just mean that influencing them at all wasn't something he had a lot of hope or expectation or even intentionality regarding. Like, he definitely wanted to rally people to fight back, but he didn't actually think folks would listen to him the way that they did. He doesn't exactly see himself as an inspirational figure, I'm sure. But contrast that with the Eren we have now, the one who used Falco to send intel back to Paradise for him, and who's now very blatantly threatening the lives of all these civilians to coerce Reiner into cooperation. And on top of it, probably never intended to spare these folks anyways. We're seeing both a manipulative element and a ruthless streak, and it's pretty chilling. We're coming to the end of our time for this installment, so those aspects of Eren, the ruthlessness and manipulation, are where I'll continue for next episode. Thanks for listening today, and I hope you had a great time. If you're enjoying the podcast, please don't forget to subscribe and turn your notifications on so you can get updates. You can also help make the show visible for new viewers by leaving a like, share, comment, or review on whichever platform you use to listen. Until next episode, be blessed and stay salty. Hello, listeners, and welcome to A Dash of Salt with AJ. I'm your host, Ahsoka Jackson, author, blogger, poet, and freelance proofreader. I ended our prior episode by discussing some of the darker traits being manifested by Aaron now, like how ruthless and manipulative he can be, and that's what we're resuming in this episode of the podcast. So let's get to it. I can't really speak much on certain aspects right now. I have to save those for later. But I saw this one girl make some pretty freaking ironic statements about Commander Erwin, saying Aaron was too unstable and that Erwin should have recognized this and killed Aaron and had another soldier take over the Titan powers. Now, this chick already said multiple things that to me demonstrate a lack of understanding when it comes to the story and characters and whatnot, so I shouldn't be so surprised. But what I want to highlight here is that I find it fairly ironic that she would cite Erwin, because given what we've seen of Erwin, as far as how far he's willing to go to achieve his goals, and the fact that he's willing to accept tremendous loss of life if he feels that's worth the larger goals, there are other things I could cite more specifically, but I can't yet in order to avoid spoiler territory. But suffice it to say, Erwin would no doubt understand where Aaron is coming from at the very least, and he might outright support the specific actions and strategies that we see Aaron come up with here and elsewhere. Heck, while maybe Erwin could have come up with alternate plans, I'm not sure if those would have involved a lower or higher cost in terms of things like civilian casualties. But as I said about Reiner in one of the episodes, I think Erwin would appreciate working with someone who has those persuasive and outright manipulative abilities, both because of the pragmatic benefit and because of how it mirrors elements of Erwin himself. I think that same thing would apply to adult Aaron now. That would actually be an extremely interesting setup when you think about it. What sort of relationship might exist between the two if Erwin had survived and could interact with a now adult Eren Yeager? Especially because, in addition to that trait of being able to make use of individual people and turn them into assets, we're also seeing this larger scale strategic skill that Eren has. Now, one thing we don't know yet is who all planned this operation against Marley and to what level of detail is planned out. But let's say for a moment that Armin is the one who planned most of this, since he's definitely the chief strategist of Squad Levi, and really the Survey Corps as a whole, I'm sure, now that Erwin is gone. Even if Armin and other folks largely handled planning the basic strategy, Eren is still in a situation where, by all indications, he's largely cut off from the team. If he's relying on mail correspondence to communicate with them, then we could expect it would take several days at minimum, if not multiple weeks, between sending intel and then getting a response back. And even though we do know Jean is here in Marley, Eren would still probably be somewhat limited in how frequently he could meet with anyone in person in order to avoid drawing suspicion. Especially because the Eldians themselves are subject to constant surveillance by the rest of Marley. So it's actually an even more challenging situation than a quote-unquote regular undercover assignment, because he's openly presenting himself as part of an ethnic group that's already under higher scrutiny than average, and that has inherent ties to the very country that Marley is about to engage in further warfare against. And we've already seen that even his relationship with Falco caught the nose of Dr. Yeager. Though it's possible that Yeager's own personal history related to the Restorationists and to the Grice family made him extra observant when it comes to this sort of thing, even if he is half crazy. As we're going to see later, half crazy and highly observant don't have to be mutually exclusive. But in any case, what you can safely infer from this overall dynamic is that even though there are other folks on the ground there, like Jean and the tall soldier who led away Pique and Galliard, Eren is in a position where he's probably having to make a good number of, how would you phrase it, executive decisions out in the field. Being in that position, you can't have someone who needs to be handheld or babysat along the way. And as I've said before, Eren was already smart as a kid. Yeah, he was aggressive, hard-headed, and emotional, and he tended to let those things get the better of him. He could be exasperating, make no mistake. But he was also capable of analyzing things and thinking on his feet, even in extremely stressful circumstances. And the Eren we have now is someone with the composure and self-control to be able to sit and have the conversation that he did with Grandpa Yeager, which is something I frankly don't think the younger Eren would have had the maturity and emotional control for. I'd fully expect Eren Yeager at 15 to be either yelling outright or interrogating the guy openly while shaking with barely controlled rage and calling him a coward. Instead, he's just like, sounds like you know a thing or two about regrets. You wouldn't happen to be speaking from experience, would you? He actually got some personal answers about something he'd probably thought about a lot, both personally as the grandson, and also due to having Grisha's memories, but without pushing the point too far and exposing himself. Nicely done. I don't want to revisit points too much right now, but all of this shows or serves to highlight some of the value Eren has as part of the team now. And I think the question of how he might have served under Erwin's authority at this point in the timeline is super intriguing. And it will probably come up again if the anime goes far enough into the storyline. Anyways, returning to the topic of manipulation, that's definitely a good time to address Falco's presence in that scene. I'm really intrigued by Eren's insistence that Falco stay there. I strongly suspect this was also part of twisting Reiner's arm in the scene. It's one thing to have that general threat of killing the folks in the apartment, but it adds a whole other dimension to also have someone present whom he knows Reiner has a personal attachment to. I don't think Reiner's even in the mindset for this, but maybe he could have justified risking civilian deaths in order to stop Eren's attack on the government forces. But now he also has Falco, this increasingly terrified and vulnerable kid, whose only hope for safety in that scene is with Reiner. Reiner had already made the decision that he was going to do his best to help him protect these kids. That was the one thing that stopped him when he was on the very precipice of committing suicide. So now, instead of just that vague threat of killing the civilians somewhere above them, Reiner's also forced to look at the face of this terrified and horrified child he's promised himself to protect. And the implicit threat from Eren is loud and clear. He's sitting just a few feet away from you, Reiner. Try anything, and the kid will be among the first to die when I shift. Clever and goddarn ruthless. Now, there is one huge caveat I realized regarding Falco's use as the hostage there. I just realized that Eren may have had more of a heart here than I even realized, but I can't explain that until sometime in the next few episodes. There's something really important we're going to find out that ties back to this scene, and once that is shown, I can tell you what I'm just now realizing about this sequence and Eren's demand to keep Falco present. But moving on with what I can say, I do think there was another element. Despite everything, I do think Eren actually did like and care about the kid. I think he was genuine in what he said about not wanting him to inherit the Armored Titan, and that Falco was a good kid he wanted to see live a long life. So I do think he felt Falco was owed at least an explanation and a chance to hear some of the truth about what was happening that day and why. I think he at least wanted to give him answers. Don't take this the wrong way for a second, though. Even if that's the case, I'm not saying that giving him the explanation or even the apology, which I do believe was sincere, although it's one of those aggravating, I regret the hurt I caused, but I'd still do it again sort of apologies. I'm not saying that either thing actually makes the situation right, or makes much of a difference at all. And I'm definitely not arguing that Falco owes Eren either forgiveness or, God forbid, gratitude now. The only thing he owes Eren is a long list of ways to go screw himself, and right now I'm in the mood to add a thing or two to that list. Like I said before, the way he cultivated a personal bond with the child, and someone said that it's been about a month of all this going on since the battle with the Mideast Allied forces. But the way he did that was on a whole other level than just hiring someone to serve as a courier. And no, as fantastic as the Wounded Warrior philosophy class was, that was not fair compensation for how badly he screwed that kid over. Especially considering what happens at the end of this episode. I expect we'll get more answers pretty soon once the battle really commences, but Eren's move of destroying the apartment complex definitely calls into question whether he and Squad Levi actually have any intention of trying to liberate and recruit the folks in Marley's internment zones. If that's the idea, then killing a bunch of those same people in your first open military strike on Marleyan turf is an incredibly bad way to go about it. He managed it quite well with Falco, but clearly charm offensives are just not Eren's preferred way of doing things. And if he and the team are there strictly to advance Paradis purposes, and there's nothing to be gained for the Eldians of Marley, then that means that there's little to no upside here for Falco that would make Eren's betrayal more forgivable. If our forces from Paradis were ultimately trying to help their fellow Eldians and free them from the abuses of the rest of Marley, that would give them a lot more leeway here when it comes to civilian deaths and when it comes to personal situations like the one with Falco. I'll finish that thought next episode. Thanks for listening today, and I hope you had a great time. If you're enjoying the podcast, please don't forget to subscribe and turn your notifications on so you can get updates. You can also help make the show visible for new viewers by leaving a like, share, comment, or review on whichever platform you use to listen. Until next episode, be blessed and stay salty. Hello listeners, and welcome to A Dash of Salt with AJ. I'm your host, Ahsoka Jackson, author, blogger, poet, and freelance proofreader. I'm going to give a recap here by resuming from the last couple of paragraphs of Part 6. If Aaron and the team are there strictly to advance Parity's purposes, and there's nothing to be gained for the Eldians of Marley, then that means that there's little to no upside here for Falco that would make Aaron's betrayal of him more forgivable. If our forces from Paradis were ultimately trying to help their fellow Eldians and free them from the abuses of the rest of Marley, that would give them a lot more leeway here when it comes to the civilian deaths and when it comes to personal situations like the one with Falco. I'd still want to give the kid 1,000,000 bear hugs, but I could at least say that this is for the best and that he and his people will ultimately be able to live good lives, rather than being treated as eternal prisoners and punching bags for Marley to take his frustrations out on and kill more or less at will. Think of what happened with Faye, and think of the fact that her family was left without justice, without even the chance to pursue justice, really. So freeing the people from that, I can take the personal betrayal and maybe the civilian deaths. That's something I want to get into for episode 6 or 7, really. But if this is purely about the focus on Paradis, then even if the attack overall is justified due to Marley's actions, what can I now say to Falco, who's inadvertently aiding the destruction of not only his country in general, but also his own ethnic and physical community within it? His fellow Marleyan Eldians, and his literal friends and neighbors within Marley specifically. Folks who have been suffering the same hell and abuse he has. If that's the reality of the situation, then simply saying that at least he's helping Paradis is cold mother-freaking comfort. And more than ever, I wish that Aaron had just hired someone to take care of the letters, because doing that to Falco is screwed. And I wonder if, in those moments of revelation, Falco realized the sheer irony of it all. He'd been wary of Reiner and wondered whether he could trust him and whether their goals had aligned. Yet now, Reiner's the one to protect him, and Aaron, the young man Falco had respected and trusted all this time, has turned out to have tricked and used him this entire time. In any case, having discussed Falco and his rather extreme experience of stranger danger, we can proceed to the other big dynamic of the conversation, the one between Aaron and Reiner. The stuff with Falco broke my heart, and the stuff with Aaron and Reiner pretty much took my breath away. Actually, I can say one more thing related to Falco. There's an interview I watched with his voice actor where he talked about what it was like to work with Kaji Yuki, Aaron's voice actor. I may have mentioned this in one of my previous episodes, it's kind of hard to keep track of at this point, but he was talking about what it was like to work with and alongside Kaji. And the short version is basically that it was like Kaji was doing such a perfect job of capturing that sort of imposing aura and that sense of command and that charisma of sorts, to where Falco's voice actor understood what the character saw there and why Falco would have been drawn to Aaron and sort of fallen under his sway as a leadership figure, if you will. And this scene, even though it's in some ways brutal and all sorts of chilling, it's also so fascinating. The conversation goes in directions you really wouldn't expect, and the elements of the performance throughout were just so perfectly done. The voice acting, the expressions, the body language, the music. And again, it feels so overwhelming, not only with juggling all the different scenes in the episode, Galliard, Tiber, and the rest, but also even just within this single scene. We have 3 different characters who each have their own mental and emotional journeys playing out throughout this scene, and it's happening simultaneously. Falco is actually experiencing some of the same shock and horror and betrayal that Aaron did in finding out that Annie and later Reiner and Berthold were traitors. He even gets teary-eyed the way Aaron had when Reiner revealed himself and Berthold. And then Reiner. He's just made the decision to live for the sake of the kids, and then runs straight into the man who currently has prime means, motive, and opportunity to end him. And clearly Reiner hasn't actually lost either his self-hatred or his suicidal streak. And just in case we didn't get it from what we saw in episode 3, this episode explicitly looped back to that idea that maybe the reason that random suicidal man told Reiner's team his own story all those years ago was that he wanted to be judged. Well, now Reiner gets that exact opportunity, actually. He gets to, well, actually is pretty much coerced into, confessing to someone in a seemingly perfect position to judge him. Someone he hurt very, very deeply. And he didn't just hurt him in a more broad and practical sense. through all the tragedy and being orphaned and everything else that came with and after the fall of Shiganshina. He also hurt him on a personal level by being someone who had given him advice and whom Eren had looked up to and regarded as a comrade, probably a mentor, and a friend. Again, just like Falco and Eren now. I get the impression from Reiner's reaction that maybe he'd been missing some details regarding what happened to Eren's mother, but he definitely knew in a general sense that Eren is someone who fully appreciates the pain and the horror and the effects of Reiner's actions. He felt the weight of it as someone on the receiving end. And if anyone does, Eren certainly deserves a confession and an explanation. And I think Reiner was actually sincere still in wanting to die, and I think he would have actually been quite content with the idea of having one of his victims be the one to end his life. The problem is, those two weren't alone. Falco was in the room. Falco, one of the very children Reiner had promised himself to look after. And like I said, I think he has this desire to be there for them and not let them down the way he'd let his Marleyan team and even the folks from Eren's side down years ago. Plus, there are all the folks in the apartments. So while I think his eventual begging for Eren to kill him was sincere, I think the bigger motivator there was that he was hoping to sacrifice himself for Falco and the rest. I think he was really hoping that if he offered himself up, that it would placate Eren's anger and he would refrain from killing everyone else. But if that was the plan, well, just Reiner's freaking luck. Apparently, Eren Yeager, of all people in the freaking Attack on Titan universe, has taken anger management classes. Or has he? And now we reach the point where we start to realize that maybe the Titans were never the biggest mystery of the series. Maybe it was Eren. His journey, just in this conversation, like I said earlier, chilling, brutal, and also effing mesmerizing. Reiner wants to be killed, and Eren goes for the jugular, and then twists, and then pulls the knife out and starts patching the wound up again and solicitously applying careful first aid. And then he pulls out a gun. You understand going in that Eren must have so much he wants to say to Reiner after all this time. Yet what he says is both more brutal and more gentle than you'd expect. It's just crazy. And it's like the conversation can in some ways be summed up as a good news, bad news message to Reiner. The good news is, it's nothing personal. The bad news is, it's nothing personal. You know how folks say it's nothing personal right before or after they do something god-awful to you? Yeah, that's the bad news one. Now, I can't be the only one who found it kind of funny when Reiner brought up the subject of how Eren had threatened revenge years ago. A big thanks to Super Sama and COD42 for reminding me where that scene was, by the way. I couldn't remember it. I couldn't remember when it was that Eren had made his revenge vow. Eren had wanted these guys to not only die, but to suffer. And with this being Eren, you can believe him when he sounds like he's going to track someone down to the ends of the earth to carry out his revenge. He would. He really would. And I think most of us were already busy polishing up a nice, satin-lined coffin for Reiner when Falco brought him downstairs and reintroduced our two old high school friends. But Eren does the last thing you'd ever expect and basically goes, that's... Nah, man, I'm not... Just forget I said that, brother, alright? Reiner's reaction there, I feel like he embodied the audience right there. Just the most pure, complete shock and confusion. Like, we must have heard you wrong. This is like having someone beat up or otherwise mistreat Eren and Mikasa Ackerman not caring. It doesn't even compute. Yet the craziest thing about it is that it's actually not without precedent, and it's not actually out of character. It does show us changes to Eren's character, but these were changes we were already shown that he's capable of. I'll talk about that in the next episode here. Thanks for listening today, and I hope you had a great time. If you're enjoying the podcast, please don't forget to subscribe and turn your notifications on so you can get updates. You can also help make the show visible for new viewers by leaving a like, share, comment, or review on whichever platform you use to listen. Until next episode, be blessed, and stay salty. Hello listeners, and welcome to A Dash of Salt with AJ. I'm your host, Ahsoka Jackson, author, blogger, poet, and freelance proofreader. I left off last episode by stating that Aaron's ability to set aside his personal grudge against Reiner is not actually out of character, and it does already have precedent from the previous seasons. So that's where our discussion resumes. For that, I'll revisit something I've spoken on before. I've already highlighted this, so I'm not going to go into detail again. But Aaron spent almost 3 seasons wanting nothing more than to slaughter and avenge himself against the Titans. But when he found out the truth of what they are, as I said, I don't think all that went away. I think he kept at least some of it, but he took the rage and hatred and everything else and switched targets. But as for the Titans themselves, he actually became deeply compassionate regarding them, and he was pained by their plight. And I feel that some folks wouldn't have been able to do this. They would have been in denial, or otherwise wouldn't have been able to let go of how they'd felt about these beings all of this time. They may have just found ways to rationalize it and hold on to the same perspective regarding them. But despite how his hatred and vengeance had driven him for all these years, Aaron was able to show such a change in behavior and mindset in some ways. And then in episode 3 of this season, we see that Aaron now has a very different understanding of the folks in Marley in much the same way, and he expands on this concept here. So what we have in this scene is something we've already established when it comes to Aaron's personality and mentality, and his maturation as a person, plus his ability to change and adapt, while in other ways still remaining the same. He's come to have a clearer view of Reiner in the same way he gained a clearer view of the Titans, and later of the citizens of Marley. He's someone who's willing and able to not just perceive super difficult truths like this, but also acknowledge and act on them. Though it makes me think of that one saying, the more things change, the more they stay the same. Aaron also expressed this and I keep talking about ironies here. Well, I'd say another is that even with all his understanding and his different viewpoint, it somewhat becomes a moot issue all the same. Because there's still the huge reality of warfare and Marley and the world's impending actions against Paradis, and their prior actions against it. I hesitate to use the word forgiveness here, but Aaron understands Reiner and doesn't bear him the same malice and ill will as before. But Aaron is still poised now as a deadly enemy to Reiner and Marley for practical reasons, even if the personal agenda is gone. So he's still there to bring death either way. And I guess the key difference we might have is the level of brutality and how much blood will be shed. He's probably going to be less brutal and violent about the attack than he would be were it largely fueled by rage and vengeance. But the attack itself is still going to happen. And if you think about it, his insight might make things a little better and easier on his victims if it affects how he carries out the attack, but it makes things way worse for Aaron himself. It's just like with Levi and the Titans. Levi didn't show much open reaction, but it's undoubtedly a huge mind screw to find out that the Titans he's been killing all this time, and he was of course the top soldier who absolutely excelled at it, these were actually human beings who didn't deserve what Marley had done to them. Heck, whether or not they deserved it, those were still ultimately human lives he was taking. That's something that should inherently carry weight even if it is deserved and doesn't warrant guilt. I don't believe it's always necessary to feel guilt or regret over the act itself, but I do believe there should always be a regret over the fact that taking human life became necessary. Like if some psycho breaks into your house and tries to attack or assault you, and you manage to kill them in self-defense, I don't believe you should have to feel bad or haunted by your actions themselves. But I think you must respect the fact that the loss of human life is a significant thing, and that it's a tragedy that things came to a point where that needed to take place. It might sound like a very shallow or meaningless sentiment. I don't regret killing you, but I regret that I had to kill you. But for me, it's a very serious thing about respect for life and appreciating the weight of it. And unfortunately, Aaron has a really worrisome problem in that area sometimes, as I highlighted in the article I wrote. I totally support what he did to the sex traffickers who kidnapped Mikasa. But the way he shook off their lives and dismissed them as monsters and animals, and then showed in his own behavior how it didn't even affect him as it reasonably should have, that's a huge, huge problem. The good news is that he doesn't seem to have turned to that cop-out or that compartmentalization in this situation. Quite the contrary, actually. Despite the blood he's about to spill, he's brutally honest about what he's discovered in his time in Marley. It's actually really beautiful and touching, though by the same token it drives home the cruelty of his impending actions and the choices he's making. He realizes that while there are jerks there and monsters, there are also really wonderful people there as well. And beyond that, he's come to understand how misguided they are. Like he said, the children there are being brainwashed from birth. What can you reasonably expect from them? And they grow up into adults who believe the same things. And of course, most of them don't get to have the experience that Reiner's team had, of going over to parties and realizing the truth. Of course, one thing I can say about the citizens of Marley as a whole is that they also choose to abuse and have much the same viewpoints regarding their own Eldian citizens, despite the chances they get to interact with them. So it's not like this is all just innocence and ignorance. There are also factors of knowing malice and dishonesty to at least some extent. But it's safe to say that yes, the average person in Marley, especially the average Eldian in an internment zone, themselves probably believes the propaganda they've been told day in and day out about how the Eldians and parties are monsters, and I guess probably that they still behave in much the same way as those from the old Eldian kingdom allegedly did. And as Eren is talking about all of this, there's such raw pain and compassion you hear in his voice. He actually sounded like he was on the verge of tears at times. That got to me so much. So I genuinely do feel that this whole situation is one that deeply pains him, and he really does regret that it's come to this. I think that for the most part, he actually doesn't want to do this, and finds the necessity or expedience of it painful. Said it before, and I'll say it again, and believe me, it'll need to be repeated this season. Eren very much has strong, empathetic, and compassionate sides to his character, and missing those really gives you an incomplete picture of who he is. Even if you want to argue that he's a monster, he's not actually a psychopath. And the apparent emptiness and numbness you see at times is more a matter of being exhausted and resigned. And I'll quote someone else on saying something that I keep forgetting myself. Eren's already grieved. I can't explain that in detail yet, but just keep that quote in mind for the future. And we still see the emotion breakthrough, like during his scene here. And I think it's quite safe to say that Eren doesn't need to explain himself to Reiner or Falco, nor does he need to put on some sort of show of fake emotion or regret here. I don't think he'd be inclined to anyways, especially with how he does still also display a very definite hostility and harshness when he wants here as well. Which brings me to easily one of the most intense moments. When he asked Reiner why Carla died, why she had to die. That's obviously one of the biggest traumas of Eren's life, so it's not shocking that he would bring this up to Reiner again. He actually already did a little during that scene where he was screaming at Reiner and Bertoldt after they kidnapped him. But I think he explained her death in more detail here than he had before, based on how Reiner seemed a little shocked at hearing it. But Eren didn't just bring it up. He described it in detail. And then he asked why. And kept asking. One man I was talking to compared it to a police interrogation. And on that note, this is where the next episode will pick up. This point in the conversation where he finally confronts Reiner about that issue again. Thanks for listening today, and I hope you had a great time. If you're enjoying the podcast, please don't forget to subscribe and turn your notifications on so you can get updates. You can also help make the show visible for new viewers by leaving a like, share, comment, or review on whichever platform you use to listen. Until next episode, be blessed and stay salty. Hello listeners, and welcome to A Dash of Salt with AJ. I'm your host, Ahsoka Jackson, author, blogger, poet, and freelance proofreader. Last episode, I'd begun talking about the point in the conversation where Eren brought up the death of Carl Yeager. So that's where we'll begin this episode of the podcast. The way Eren twisted that knife, I was feeling some pain. He asked, Reiner answered, and Aaron was like, no, not good enough. I freaking asked you why. You're missing the freaking point, so let's try this again. Why? That's how the tone felt to me. The unspoken anger and tension there. When Reiner got to the part about saving the world, this is another moment where, intensely and extremely dark as the whole situation was, I still absolutely had to laugh because it was pretty satisfying seeing that sarcasm and sass and attitude from Aaron kick in. And he's so back and forth in this whole scene that I think we as the audience are in very much the same situation as Reiner. Extremely anxious and trying to gauge Aaron's words and emotions and what he's about to do. He seems like he's in a pretty mercurial state right now, and he's holding the threat of death at this point. So we're just hoping we can maybe calm him down or placate him somehow. But his response when Reiner brought up saving the world, like that little look downwards and to the side, and the way he angled his body there, and then how he snapped his gaze back to Reiner's with that really unnerving dead and maybe slightly crazed look again. It's like he did this whole theatric thing where he's mock pondering what Reiner said. Oh, well, if it was save the world, I guess it's all good then. I don't miss my mom that much. Matter of fact, I think my PTSD just went away. It reminds me a little of the character Michael Weston from Burn Notice. That's a dang good show, by the way, with phenomenal acting and other elements. One thing I thought about Weston from early on is that the way his mood, or to be more exact, apparent mood, can turn on a dime, honestly is one of the scariest things about him. The way he can go from jovial and grinning, if the situation requires it, to suddenly an ice-cold stare that shows his real feelings, or may just be yet another mask. That stuff is really unnerving, trust and believe. And actually, Michael Weston is a spy as well, so that's a core thing for him, being able to change masks at the drop of a hat. Though the difference between himself and our favorite Eldian spy in this scene is that I don't feel Aaron's really acting per se, other than the sarcastic, theatric bits. I do think he's definitely keeping a lot of cards still close to his chest, though. He's drip-feeding us these bits and pieces about what he's learned, about what's going through his head at this moment, and about the questions he's had on his mind. Yet, he's still so hard to gauge, and the way his responses vary is something that keeps him really unpredictable. And I wonder if that itself is partially a strategic thing. I've heard of the concept of keeping your enemy off balance, or your opponent off balance, and I think the way Aaron is going back and forth, especially in such an extremely high-stress, high-stakes situation, may partly be a strategic thing, and not purely a question of himself just getting his thoughts out, stream of consciousness style. Though I think there's a little of the latter as well. I feel like it's partly a planned confrontation that he's been wanting for a long time now, partly a strategic ploy to position and keep certain individuals where he wants them to be, and partly a last-minute session of venting and confessions at what may be one of the last points he gets a chance to do so, especially when it comes to Reiner. Paradis is about to finally bring the fight to Marley, so this is the calm immediately before the storm. Speaking of confessions, I think we can all agree that one of the most striking and significant parts of the exchange is when Aaron says that he and Reiner are really the same. And he doesn't just say it once, he says it twice. And the second time comes after this self-deprecation and self-abasement from Reiner, so I think it really means that all of it fits for him. Number one, they're a victim of unfortunate circumstances that are somewhat forcing them into this situation and these actions. 2, they both have higher, more noble purposes they believe in here that have been driving them to do these things. 3, they also have more selfish, self-serving reasons that are motivating them, and which have them going on rather than backing down or making a different choice. And 4, since he said, "We really are the same" again, after Reiner had self-abased, then that may have also been part of what Aaron was referring to. I think he's already preemptively feeling a deep sense of guilt and self-loathing and regret over the stuff he's about to do and the blood that's about to be shed. And there's a smaller scale of regret he already has regarding the situation with Falco, I'm sure. Aaron's got to be acutely aware of how he did the same thing to Falco that Reiner did to him. And maybe he wants Reiner to be aware of that situation as well. For all of his faults, one thing I can say about Aaron is that he seems to have a pretty good ability to perceive himself clearly and also to be honest about what it is that he sees. It's like that same outwardly directed ability I pointed out regarding his perceptiveness and accompanying honesty when it comes to other folks, even enemies. And he not only perceives it himself, but is also willing to rather bluntly express his thoughts and emotions to others, even when it ventures into very surprising and downright disturbing territory. So I give him credit for that. Now, of course, we also witness in this season how he's willing to use deception to get what he wants, and twist and turn people to get what he needs. He's also rather cagey at times, so both the lying and the closed-off sides of him do inherently make it hard to know when he's being honest and when he's just full of it. But I do think that by looking at things like the context, what we've learned from past seasons, and other clues, we should be able to work out the truth over time. All things considered, I think he's being very honest in this scene with Reiner and Falco. I don't think there's a lot of strategic benefit for him right here in the conversation, aside from the fact that he's stalling and that he's also biding his time for Willie to make the actual declaration. It is also possible that he's trying to throw Reiner off some psychologically ahead of the fight. Remember what I said about keeping your enemy off balance? But he could have taken a purely angry approach there and just hammered home the guilt element, which he certainly did to some extent. But the exact combo we get from him, shifting between anger, understanding, sadness, compassion, and sarcasm, is something that I don't think was necessary from a tactical standpoint. I think what it really was instead was a very surprising and raw exchange where he wanted to finally get some things off his chest after having a long time to consider them. And as I said before, I don't know that I'd go so far as saying that he has forgiven Reiner for all that happened, and especially Carla's death, but he clearly had gained a more accurate perspective of what Reiner had gone through and was about, and there was a certain sense of mercy and grace that ended up accompanying that. While he's still at war with them, he no longer has as harsh a view towards them or as hostile an intent, and he apparently wanted Reiner to know that. And if he and Reiner really are alike, then there are a few things you can possibly extrapolate from that. A, even as he was speaking to Reiner, he was arguably speaking to himself as well, even with stuff like the sarcasm. He knows that even if he has a good reason for it, that's cold comfort for the folks who are going to suffer from his actions, like the people who lose family members and have their own lives turned upside down. B, maybe he understood what we talked about in episode 3, about how, just like the suicidal man from years ago, now Reiner himself has this overpowering guilt and this need to confess his sins and be judged by someone before he dies. Aaron actually gave Reiner a chance to get it off his chest. And as a side note, Falco also got to finally hear the truth as well. The truth about Reiner, about Aaron, about Marley and Paradis. C, by hearing Reiner's confession and working through what he had done, and then stating himself to be just the same, it's like Aaron is subtly providing a parallel or vicarious confession and unburdening that way for himself. The good, the bad, the ugly. The mitigating factors, the aggravating factors. Again, maybe that was also part of why Aaron wanted Falco to be there. He wanted Reiner to know that he had done the same sort of thing now, of gaining and betraying trust, and using and deceiving and manipulating people. Even the areas wherein they differ sort of balance each other out. Reiner and his team were brainwashed children. What Aaron and his team are about to do, they're doing as adults who now have a much better handle on the reality of things. But on balance, the attack itself from Paradis is much more justified or justifiable than Marley's attack. Thanks for listening today, and I hope you had a great time. If you're enjoying the podcast, please don't forget to subscribe and turn your notifications on so you can get updates. You can also help make the show visible for new viewers by leaving a like, share, comment, or review on whichever platform you use to listen. Until next episode, be blessed and stay salty. Hello listeners, and welcome to A Dash of Salt with AJ. I'm your host, Ahsoka Jackson, author, blogger, poet, and freelance proofreader. So I guess 2 more key details about Aaron's reactions in the scene with Reiner and Falco, and then I can talk about something from the manga right quick. The first thing. There's a certain point where Willie is explaining himself and talking about wanting to have a future. Ooh, come to think of it, this is that same theme from the Season 4 trailer. It talks about fighting to take back the future. And that's really what this battle is going to determine on a very real level, as we have the world as a whole turning against parties and intending to annihilate it. Whom will the future belong to? Wow. So, bonus detail there, I guess. But anyway, Willie uses the phrase born into this world to explain his motivations and his determination to fight. And they show Aaron's eye just going wide when he hears that phrase. And it looks pretty eerie, too, because he still has that sort of dead, empty look, even as that phrase is catching his attention. The combo kind of looks a little crazed, honestly. Which makes me think of something I saw reading the scene in the manga finally. Aaron's expressions during that combo are freaking unnerving. And I feel like they actually brought in a little more nuance in the anime version, and were able to let us know that there was a less harsh side that was also meant to come through in the scene. And of course, the voice acting and other elements also help with that. He's still scary as heck in that scene either way, though. But that phrase, born into this world, this is like a core thing related to Aaron's perspective and motivations. It came up during the fight to close the breach in trust. When Aaron went unconscious and became trapped in this fantasy world while in Titan form, Armin had to be the one to go wake him up. Okay, wow. I just realized something related to the manga. I don't know how I'm just now noticing it, but it kind of kills me that I can't say it now. This is way, way down the line. But there's something there in that that's going to be really applicable to really late stuff. Not going to tell you what part of that whole sequence it is, though. I'm only saying that I'm realizing there's something in that whole sequence of events and trust that connects to something significant later on. But what I wanted to highlight here initially was that phrase. Armin is trying to wake Aaron up and get him to remember what he's fighting for and why. And what Aaron eventually says about why he's even fighting to go beyond the walls and out into the world beyond is that it's because he was born into this world. Now, in my case, I feel that the English dub actually helped clarify this for me, and it's an example of why I sometimes like to watch both subbed and dubbed versions of a show. In the English dub, what Aaron says is that this world is his birthright. That phrase really explained it for me. He's saying that this world, and not just Paradise, but planet Earth as a whole, is his home, and there's a mutual belonging there where it belongs to him and he belongs to it. And we're in this situation where, as far as anyone knew at the time, the rest of humanity had been reduced to living on a tiny bit of the Earth's surface, hiding away in fear and basically hoping to not go extinct. And they lacked not only experience of the outside world, but also knowledge, to the point that the very concept and existence of such a thing as an ocean was a carefully guarded secret. So to ask why he wanted to be a part of the larger world was sort of like asking someone why they'd care about being able to walk or dance or otherwise make normal, healthy use of their legs. Why wouldn't they would be a more reasonable question. I will say that as much as I'm trying to get into Aaron's head, I can only wonder what was going through his head when he heard Willie use that phrase and his eye widened in reaction to that. Did it just feel uncanny to him? Did it maybe feel like a bit of a cruel irony to hear someone he was about to kill explain that he was motivated by some of the same ideas and feelings as Aaron himself? Was it just sad or maybe a confirmation for him of the kinship between the people inside the walls and the people in the outside world? How in many ways they are alike. Or did he even feel ticked off by it because Willie is saying this while seeking to snuff out the lives and freedom of the people in Paradise? Maybe Aaron was thinking, I know this wench did not just say that to justify screwing us over even more. Or maybe it simply helped solidify Aaron's decisions and spur him to action, because it reminded him of what he was fighting for and what the point was of the killing he was about to engage in. There is one more theory I have about what he could have been thinking when he heard that line, but it's another manga thing, so stashing it away for later. I should probably start a file so I can keep track of all of this. Anyways, speaking of spurring him on, here's the other detail from his reactions that I want to mention. I said earlier that this scene contained a super important moment that I'd want to see the full context for. That moment was Aaron's reaction to the crowd. It comes towards the end of the speech when Willie is finally rallying everyone after having gotten their emotions to the right point. He finally makes his intentions clear, calling upon the other nations in attendance to aid him in the war against pirates. I think two main things were brought up here in relation to the scene. One was this question of whether or not these other nations were actually enemies of parties like Marley was. And the other thing was Aaron's reaction to this, and whether... I guess the issues were whether the attack itself was reasonable, and also whether Aaron wanted to do this. That feels like a weird way of putting it, but I think it'll become clear when I elaborate in a second. This really ties into the question of the timing of the attack. That really goes further back than just his speech, but the gist of it is that the world had time to take a different course. Like I said previously, Marley has been subjecting parties to a lot of stuff for a lot of years now. And we don't currently know how long Paradies has had operatives over on Marley and Turf, but we know it's been 4 years since Paradies discovered the existence of the outside world, and they haven't yet attacked like Aaron's about to. And now Marley is not only announcing a renewed and intensified warfare, and really genocide campaign against Paradies, but also drawing other nations of the world into this as well, as a way of redirecting the aggression that had been directed against Marley due to Marley's warmongering BS. And it can definitely be argued that the most pivotal moment in this speech is when Willie finally makes clear his request to the other nations, and they roar with applause in response. That is really the moment that pulls the trigger. It's the moment folks highlighted when an argument was made about whether or not these other nations were really a part of this. Even though they hadn't yet drawn up formal documents or agreements, what's made abundantly clear for us, and people were saying that they feel the manga went out of its way to do this, to make sure we were clear on this. These nations are in agreement with this plan, and Willie has their support. This is what these nobles and government officials from foreign nations are indicating. And we had that scene in episode 4 with that one guy who botched the speech, and they were not having it. They just gave him the evil eye and didn't play along out of politeness or anything else. So it's not like this is just posturing. And what was demonstrated in that scene is that a lot of these folks have a personal connection to Willie, plus they just find him persuasive. I'm pretty sure that's the big point of having him deliver this war rally. He has status, charisma, and actual power that all give him the ability to go beyond just steering Marley itself and actually pull the other nations along as well. He's certainly good at what he does, the son of a gun. And we see this key moment where Aaron is listening to the speech reaching that climax point, and then we have the roar of the crowd. And Aaron just sort of closes his eyes in response as he hears them. You cannot downplay what he's hearing there. These foreign dignitaries are cheering for his people's deaths. They're cheering for the Eldians' blood. This is essentially a goddarned lynch mob that Willie has whipped up and is about to turn loose against Paradies. They could have protested or stayed silent, but instead they're heartily, enthusiastically giving their assent, and it's very clear that Willie now has them hook, line, and sinker. Thanks for listening today, and I hope you had a great time. If you're enjoying the podcast, please don't forget to subscribe and turn your notifications on so you can get updates. You can also help make the show visible for new viewers by leaving a like, share, comment, or review on whichever platform you use to listen. Until next episode, be blessed and stay salty. Hello listeners, and welcome to A Dash of Salt with AJ. I'm your host, Ahsoka Jackson, author, blogger, poet, and freelance proofreader. Last episode, we were talking about the climax of Willie Tiber's speech, Aaron's reaction to it, and the exact timing of Aaron's strike. Aaron was waiting both for Willie to make clear his intent and for the world to make clear his reaction, and he did not attack until those two things happened. Marley had already been attacking parties anyways, so they arguably didn't need to wait that long, but it's probably the factor of seeing how the other nations would decide that was the more crucial thing here, especially since they were about to get caught up in the attack. And not just caught up in it, really. If they had indicated that they weren't interested in Willie's plans, then I really question if Eren would have gone through with this at all. The last thing Paradis needed was to make enemies of nations that could have been allies. But these nations, in that moment, made clear that they were already enemies, ones being told that time was of the essence and that they needed to go wipe out Paradis ASAP. And while I do feel quite confident in saying that part of Eren did want this fight, I also feel that for the most part he really didn't. The exact frame varies between the manga and anime. The manga shows us just his eyes, while the anime shows us his old face. But in both versions, what you really pick up from him is a sense of weariness or resignation more than anything. In the anime, he has almost like a tiny sort of smile, but I definitely feel confident saying that this is not really a happy smile, aside from maybe thinking, well, I guess I can finally do this now. I knew this was coming anyways. But mainly it's more like a sad, exasperated, resigned smile, because he finally has his answer. He and Paradis have waited, and they've hoped, and like folks said, Eren has darned well waited long enough. And this is the outcome. The world is merrily getting out its freaking torches and pitchforks and getting ready to go crush the million or so folks on Paradis Island. And I very much believe what Eren expressed about his realizations regarding those he had seen as enemies, and I genuinely believe that for the most part he had hoped for peace and feels a lot of pain and regret over the lives he is about to take. Even going back to episode 3, he talks about the tragedy and horror of warfare as a whole, and he's definitely speaking as someone intimately acquainted with warfare, as both a civilian and a soldier. You know, there's a lot that goes on in this season, and just this attack on Liberio is something that I still feel rather conflicted about. But one thing I found beneficial to be reminded of periodically is that Marley had declared war. And again, after already having engaged in the 9-year situation that our story has covered, plus the years before that of victimizing people and turning them into mindless titans to continue imprisoning the folks within the walls. So military action against Marley for this was already overdue. And the additional indication Paradis was given here at this rally was that the other nations had also decided to join in this. It's just that the timing throws me off, because you normally don't have a near-instant turnaround like this. Delayed in the case of Marley, but immediate in terms of these other nations. The intention to wage war is established, and Paradis' answer comes within seconds. As many folks have said, what they're really just about to get is a reverse card played against them. They chose war, and they got an instant reply. And like I said before, they didn't even treat the Eldians like people. They weren't talking diplomacy or negotiation. They were talking slaughter, like their lives didn't count for anything and could be discarded like that. And we've seen that this is also how they treat the Eldians within Marley already. So that lets you know how unlikely it is that Paradis itself could have calmed them down and dissuaded them verbally, especially once they were under Willie's influence. As conflicted as I am about the civilian toll here, the more I learn about the overall situation, the clearer it becomes that the attack as a whole was most likely justified. And whether I should primarily consider the action itself right or wrong, I do feel that the primary fault for the deaths of civilians there actually lies with Marley, because they're the ones who've been provoking, terrorizing, and committing violence against the folks of Paradis for years now. I've compared it before to the legal concept where if deaths occur during the commission of a felony, the person or persons committing the felony can be charged with those deaths, even if they didn't personally kill anyone. Like if you're robbing a bank and get into a shootout with the security, you can be held liable for a civilian death even if it was a guard's bullet that hit them, because you're the one who behaved illicitly and created the deadly situation in the first place. Quick disclaimer, I am not an attorney and do not consider me qualified to give legal advice. Go hire an actual attorney for that. Okay, now as I was saying, to me, there's a similar principle at work here. That doesn't necessarily absolve Paradis or Eren personally of responsibility, mind you. It simply means that for me, Marley actually bears the largest burden of responsibility for what happened here, because its greed and aggression against Paradis and other nations are what create the recent dynamics, as I highlighted in the first part of my response to this episode. And there's certainly a massive level of poetic karma here in how the strike on Liberio somewhat mirrors the attack on Shiganshina. I'm still not ready to give them a pass yet on the civilian deaths, but I do think I can say that the attack by Paradis is more justifiable and more reasonable than the one by Marley. First of all, Paradis is striking in self-defense. Self-defense has been a long time coming. And second of all, I think the attack is at least more pragmatic and efficient and less wasteful of civilian lives. Marley breached the walls and let the Titans in just to create chaos, infiltrate, and see what the current king's response would be. Paradis is executing a direct strike to take out military and government officials. While the approaches of each side both cost the lives of innocent civilians, Paradis' attention is at least focused on specifically taking out folks who hold direct responsibility and pose direct threats, and whose deaths will have significant impact in terms of giving parties a chance to fight back. So at the very least, I consider their actions less extreme and less excessive than what Marley did. Thus far, anyways. We've only seen the very beginning of the attacks, so we'll need to see how it develops from there. Oh, I almost forgot this. I had earlier questioned why Aaron set up shop under the apartments rather than closer to the stage, given how many civilians he was going to kill that way. It seemed really needless. But I think I figured it out. I realized that under the circumstances, the event itself probably would have had a decent amount of security and screening. It was probably not open to the general public, especially not Eldians. Folks like Annie's father and Reiner's mother, family members of the Warriors, would have been exceptions. But we're talking about a crowd otherwise full of foreign dignitaries, military and government leaders, etc. So what I realized is that the apartment building directly behind the stage was probably the closest location that Aaron could actually wait in, plus have his whole exchange with Reiner in the interval, without needing to worry about being scrutinized extra or obtaining a special security clearance. And Eldians are already monitored and scrutinized extra anyways. So I think I finally figured out why he was there rather than simply being in the midst of the crowd itself if they were his real target. I still don't like it, but it seems way more reasonable to me now than it did for a good while, especially after what he'd said about his current perspective on the folks there. It's like, the first thing you do after all of that is kill a whole bunch of civilians first, instead of having the first strike hit the actual target? What in the actual goddarn heck, Aaron? But now, I think I get it. Alright folks, now what I've expressed thus far, those are the feelings I've developed recently regarding this whole situation and this attack in Liberia. But now there's a new kicker that highlights even more just how responsible Marley actually is for this. The caveat is that I'm not sure I should share this yet. It's super relevant, and it comes from the section of the story that episode 5 covers. But it's very possible that the plan is to show us this information in episode 6 or later, just like how we got the crawling scene with Peak later in the story than we expected. So my compromise here is that I'm having this off in its own separate episode. It should be about 5 minutes long or so. But the main reaction is done now, so you don't have to worry about missing anything if you want to skip that bonus part. Like I said, they may reveal that information in the next episode or 2 of the show anyways, and I can always refer folks back to the bonus installments at the appropriate time. Oh, by the way, I looked it up, and yeah, folks seem to have the same explanation that I came up with regarding Aaron's transformation. It would have been different if he were further down and there were thicker layers of rock and earth surrounding him, but where he was situated in that basement and with the building above, the structure was thin and fragile enough that his Titan form could simply break through it in the transformation, rather than being crushed or compressed. Alright guys, thank you so much for listening, and I hope you've enjoyed my series of reactions to episode 5. I can't wait to hear more of your own thoughts as well. By the way, it's going to take a long time to subtitle all of this, but I don't want to leave my followers on YouTube hanging. I want to make sure that this is released for them in some form before episode 6, the Warhammer Titan, premieres. So my compromise is this. I'll release these remaining episodes as a single lengthy YouTube video, which will be accompanied by a rough transcript or captions, rather than the more exact ones I normally do. I'll still make the separate short-form videos with the exact subtitles later on, but this is to make sure it's available before episode 6, in at least some form, for folks who prefer to use YouTube, or cannot really use the audio-only format due to things like hearing difficulties. And like I said, it will be a rough transcript and / or YouTube captions, so the timing and wording will not be exact, and neither will the spelling. So please don't get snarky with me about the proofreading, okay? I'm directing that energy towards doing however much I can of the on-screen subtitles before episode 6 comes out, and I need to start work on that. I also need to sleep, eat, and see if I can get caught up on some of the videos from fellow Attack on Titan reactors, like the Bearded Saiyan. Okay, closing note finished. In the meantime, don't forget to subscribe and turn your notifications on so you get updates. And you can help make the podcast visible for new viewers by leaving a like, share, comment, or review on whichever platform you use to listen. Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, social media, etc. Be blessed and stay salty. Hello listeners, and welcome to A Dash of Salt with AJ. I'm your host, Ahsoka Jackson, author, blogger, poet, and freelance proofreader. Because of the format and length here, I'll skip my usual outro and just say thank you in advance for being with me throughout this exploration of episode 5. Declaration of War was an incredible and beautiful episode, and it definitely lived up to the excitement and anticipation I had regarding it. and I'm so glad and grateful that I was able to largely avoid spoilers for a lot of it. Allez, allez. Anyways, I'll go back over some of my closing paragraphs from part 11 to explain what we're covering here in this bonus segment. What I've expressed so far, those are the feelings I've developed recently regarding this whole situation and this attack in Liberia. But now there's a new kicker that highlights even more just how responsible Marley actually is for this. The caveat is that I'm not sure I should share this yet. It's super relevant, and it comes from the section of the story that episode 5 covers, but it's very possible that the plan is to show us this information in episode 6 or later, just like how we got the crawling scene with Peak later in the story than we expected. So my compromise here is that I'm having this off in its own separate episode. It should be about 5 minutes long or so, but the main reaction is done now, so you don't have to worry about missing anything if you want to skip that bonus part. Like I said, they may reveal that information in the next episode or 2 of the show anyways, and I can always refer folks back to the bonus installment at the appropriate time. Okay, gotta give you an extra second to turn this off if you want to avoid the manga section. Still here? Okay, well, I'll try to be brief for once. I now know why someone said Willie Tybur is like Dr. Evil. And here we have more of that whole chess thing, because now I'm wondering who fell for whose trap at this point. Willie Tybur and General Magath, mainly Tybur, actually set this whole thing up. Tybur wanted to draw out the infiltrators, and he was using himself, the dignitaries and government officials, and the military leaders as bait. Bait he fully intended to have destroyed. He even told Magath to use it as an opportunity to clear out the lousy folks he wanted to get rid of. Remember what we talked about with episode 3, the shift in power? He told him to use this as an opportunity to get rid of the old military and replace them with folks Magath deemed more suitable. And he also wanted the dignitaries there because of how their deaths would help turn the nations of the world against Paradis. Now, as I pointed out already, he clearly convinced them anyways by the time Eren finally accepted it and made his move. But I guess it makes sense to also have that plan, because even if the speech didn't convince them, the deaths of those people was pretty much guaranteed to seal the deal anyways. Getting them to verbally support Willie beforehand was just the cherry on top. It sort of made the annihilation of Paradis sort of their dying wish, eh? Again, it's hard to even see who won here. On the one hand, it kind of seems like Paradis fell into Tybur's trap, but on the other hand, it's like they needed to do it anyways, and that it was still a really good tactical move at that point, because the war was imminent either way. And that's the thing about it. Willie was trying to make sure it was a no-win situation. He was hoping that Paradis would take advantage of the opportunity to attack, but even if they had held off, he planned on verbally convincing the other nations to join the attack on Paradis anyways. So the world was going to come for their blood either way. So I guess at least taking out military and government VIPs, and thus damaging the ability to launch an immediate attack, was the better of the two options for Paradis at this point, even if that was what Willie was hoping for. It doesn't stop there, though. There's a final part that's even more sinister. In order to make things extra convincing, Willie wanted the Eldian civilians in Liberia to be wiped out. This absolute son of a gun wanted to maximize civilian casualties to make Paradis look bad and convince the world how evil they were. When Magath pointed out how many deaths would occur, Willie's initial response was to dismiss it and act like it was fine because it would just be Eldians, the descendants of devils, dying anyways. I guess Tybur really wasn't kidding when he expressed how much he hated and despised his own bloodline and heritage. Even Magath looked freaked out by how the guy was talking. And Tybur saw this and pointed out that Magath had already been willing to throw away the lives of Eldians himself in a military context, which is something we saw covered in episode 1 of the season. Tybur said that their lives shouldn't matter anymore just because they're not wearing military uniforms. And then he took things even further. Beyond just dismissing the value of the lives, he actually said that the deaths of the Eldians in Liberia, himself included, were the most important element of the whole freaking show. As I said, the tragic civilian deaths of fellow Eldians would make the forces from Paradis look especially bad, and Tybur was saying that if he managed to be a lone survivor, it wouldn't be convincing, so he also needed to become a tragic victim and basically martyr in the attack. He also had the gall to speak of it like it was some type of penance on his part. Pretty sure any sense of nobility flew by this self-hating jack-off years ago, but alright. And at the end of that scene, Magath agreed to the plan and shook Tiber's hand, still looking pretty stunned and kind of aghast. And you know what he said? I'm certain that Eldians are the descendants of devils, and I'm certain that we too are devils. So yeah, that little tidbit that I just found out really multiplies what I had already felt regarding Marley's responsibility regarding the lives lost in Liberia. Now it goes beyond having provoked the attack. They actually set this whole thing up and deliberately maximized civilian deaths, which I truly think is the opposite of what Aaron and his comrades would have wanted and hoped for in a situation like this.